If you ever went to summer camp as a kid, I need you to think back right now. Think about the one counselor nobody talked about. Every camp had one. I didn't think about mine for almost 20 years. Then last summer, I found a photograph that made my hands go cold, and I finally understood why. I was 10 years old, and it was the summer of 2003, and my parents sent me to a camp in the mountains of North Carolina called Camp Yana. It was the kind of place with wooden cabins, a lake with a rope swing, and a mess hall that smelled like burnt toast every single morning. I went there for 3 summers in a row. This story is about the third one. There was a counselor named Gary. He wasn't like the other counselors. The other ones were college kids, loud, always playing guitar around the fire, always trying to get us to do the camp cheer louder. Gary was older, maybe 35. He didn't do the cheers. He ran the archery range, and he was quiet in a way that made the other adults uncomfortable, though none of them ever said why. I only had one real interaction with Gary that summer, and I want to tell you about it exactly the way I remember it, because for years I told myself I was misremembering. I wasn't. It was the second week, free period, right after lunch when kids could pick an activity. I picked archery because my friend Danny wanted to, and Gary was running it that day instead of the usual guy. There were maybe 6 of us. Gary showed us how to nock an arrow, how to draw the string back to our cheek, all the normal stuff. He was patient. He was actually really good at teaching it. I remember thinking he seemed nicer than the other kids said. Then, toward the end of the period, Danny got called away because his cabin had a schedule conflict, and it was just me and Gary and one other kid named Priya, who was maybe 8 and barely paying attention, more interested in the dirt by her shoes. Gary told me to grab the last few arrows from downrange, near the target backstop, which was normal. That was just part of the job of packing up. I walked out toward the target, and behind the target in the tree line, maybe 30 feet past where the range officially ended, there was a shape. I want to be careful here because I was 10, and it was dappled light coming through pine trees, and I've had 20 years to convince myself I imagined it. But I didn't imagine it. There was a man standing in the trees, not moving, just standing there facing the range, wearing a dark green jacket even though it was July. I froze for a second, the way you do as a kid when something feels wrong before your brain can explain why. And then I heard Gary's voice behind me, closer than I expected, saying my name, telling me to hurry up and grab the arrows because the next group was coming. When I turned back around to look at the tree line, the man was gone. I told Gary what I saw. I remember his face didn't do what an adult's face is supposed to do. He didn't look concerned. He didn't ask me to describe the man or say he'd radio the front office. He just said, probably a hiker. People cut through here sometimes. And he said it fast, like he wanted the sentence to be over. That night I told my counselor, a college kid named Ben, and Ben actually took it seriously. He walked me to the camp director's cabin and I repeated the story. The director wrote some things down, said they'd have staff patrol the tree line and sent me back to my cabin. Nothing else happened that summer. No other kid mentioned seeing a man in the woods. I stopped thinking about it entirely, the way kids do, because 2 days later there was a color war and I forgot the world existed outside of Capture the Flag. I didn't think about Camp Yana again in any real way until last year, when my mother was cleaning out her attic and mailed me a box of my old stuff. Yearbooks, camp photos, a friendship bracelet Danny made me that I'd completely forgotten about, and near the bottom, there was an official camp photo from that third summer, the kind they take on the first day, all the cabins lined up with their counselors. I found myself in the photo, front row, squinting at the sun, and I found Gary standing at the back with the other staff, arms crossed, not smiling. And then, almost as a reflex, I looked past the group, into the background of the photo at the tree line behind the mess hall. There was a man standing in the trees. He was wearing a dark green jacket. He was too far back for the photo to catch his face clearly, but you could see he was facing the camera directly, not walking, not doing anything except standing there watching 30 children get photographed. I sat with that picture for a long time before I did anything about it. I ended up finding an old camper Facebook group for Yana alumni, people who'd gone there in the 90s and 2000s, now all in their 30s and 40s like me. I posted the photo and asked if anyone recognized the man in the background. Within a day, I had 11 replies. 8 of them said some version of the same thing. They remembered him too. Different summers, different years, always the same detail. A man in a green jacket at the edge of the property, always near wherever the kids were gathered, always gone the moment an adult looked directly at him. One woman, who'd been a counselor there in 1999, wrote something that I still think about most nights. She said camp management knew. She said there had been at least 2 formal complaints filed with the county before my summer even happened, and that instead of calling the police, the camp quietly extended the tree-line fencing by about 40 feet the following year and told staff to say nothing to parents, because enrollment was already down and they couldn't afford the story getting out. I looked into camp records after that. Camp Yana closed permanently in 2009. The reason given was declining enrollment. I couldn't find a single article, a single police report, anything that would confirm what that woman told me. Camps like that rarely generate paper trails, especially 20 years ago, especially in small counties where everybody knows everybody. What I keep coming back to is this: Gary's reaction. The way he rushed past what I said instead of asking a single follow-up question, the way his face didn't move. I've thought about it for months now, and there's really only one explanation that fits everything, one that I don't want to be true, but which is the only one that makes the pieces line up. I think Gary knew exactly who that man was, and I think that's why he needed me to stop looking. I'm about to tell you something I've never told anyone outside my own family, and even they don't know all of it. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, the kind of place where everybody's parents knew everybody else's parents, and kids rode bikes until the streetlights came on. My best friend growing up was a boy named Denny Whitfield. We were 7 when we met, inseparable by 8, and by 10 I was basically a second son in that house. Denny's dad, Mr. Whitfield, worked nights at a plant 2 towns over. His mom, Carol, was sweet, a little quiet, always baking something. Their house was a plain 2-story with a detached garage out back that Mr. Whitfield kept locked. Always. That wasn't unusual. My own dad kept his garage locked too, tools and all that. Kids don't question locked doors. Locked doors are just part of being a kid in someone else's house. We used to play in Denny's basement, which had this old chest freezer against the far wall, the kind people used for deer meat or bulk groceries. It hummed all the time, this low mechanical drone that became just part of the noise of being in that house. I probably heard that hum 1,000 times over the years and never thought about it once. Denny and I lost touch in high school, the way friends do. He moved with his family to Indiana when we were 15, sudden, no real goodbye, just gone one September. I always figured it was his dad's job. I didn't think about it for years. Life moves on. College, a job, a marriage, a kid of my own. Then 2 winters ago, my mother called me. She still lived in that same Ohio town, and she told me the local paper had run a story that morning. The old Whitfield house, abandoned since the family left, sold and resold a few times, finally condemned, was being torn down to make way for a small housing development. And during the demolition, workers clearing out the detached garage found something underneath the concrete slab floor. I want to be careful here, because this is where it stops being a story about my childhood and starts being something else. The workers found a sealed compartment under that garage floor. Inside it were personal belongings, men's and women's, different sizes, different decades of style, along with documentation that led investigators to connect Mr. Whitfield to at least 3 disappearances going back almost 20 years. People who'd passed through that town: a drifter, a woman from 2 counties over, a teenager who'd been reported as a runaway. I sat with the phone against my ear in my kitchen, and I felt the floor tilt under me, because I had been in that garage. Once, when I was maybe 9 years old, I'd followed Denny out there because he said his dad had a broken slingshot we could fix. The garage was unlocked for maybe 4 minutes, and I remember standing in that space, sawdust and motor oil in the air, my sneaker on a patch of concrete that looked slightly different from the rest, lighter, newer, like it had been poured separately. I remember thinking, even then, that's weird. And then Denny's dad's truck pulled into the driveway, and Denny grabbed my arm so hard it left a mark and hauled me back inside the house before his father even parked. He told me never to go in the garage again. He said it in a voice I'd never heard him use before, flat and scared, a 10-year-old's voice trying to sound like an adult's. I didn't think about that day again for over 30 years. Not once. Kids forget things like that, especially when nothing happens right afterward, especially when the friendship just keeps going like normal the next morning. But sitting in my kitchen with my mother's voice in my ear, it came back whole. The article didn't mention Denny. It mentioned Mr. Whitfield, who by then was already deceased. He died of a heart attack almost a decade earlier, quietly in Indiana, never once questioned by police in his life. It mentioned Carol, who investigators said cooperated fully and claimed to have known nothing, though there are people in my hometown to this day who don't believe that for a second. And it mentioned, briefly, that the family had one son who could not be located for comment. I spent that whole night trying to remember Denny's face. Not as an adult, I have no idea what he looks like now, but as a 10-year-old grabbing my arm in that garage doorway, the fear on his face, I remember that clearly. I used to think it was fear of getting in trouble for going somewhere we weren't supposed to. Now I think it might have been something else. Now I think that maybe, even at 10 years old, some small, terrible part of Denny already knew. I still live an hour and a half from that town. I haven't driven past where the house used to be, and I don't plan to. But every so often, usually late at night, I think about that hum, that constant, boring, mechanical hum of a chest freezer in a basement I spent half my childhood in, 6 feet away from where I was sitting, completely unaware. And I think about how many hours of my life I spent in that house, comfortable, safe, laughing with my best friend, while something underneath us, or near us, or connected to us in ways I still don't fully understand, was quietly, patiently waiting to be found. 30 years. That's how long it stayed buried, and the only reason it ever came up at all was a housing development that needed the land. You know that feeling when you're a kid, and your parents tell you a place is completely safe, and you believe them with your whole heart. That's the story I want to tell you today, because when I was 10 years old, the safest place I knew turned into the scariest night of my life. And it happened somewhere so ordinary. You've probably been there yourself 100 times. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, the kind of place where everybody's parents knew each other, where the biggest excitement of the year was the county fair. My best friend was a kid named Tyler, and every summer, his family took me along on their camping trip to a state park about 2 hours from home. Same campground every single year. We knew the trails, we knew the ranger station, we knew which spots had the best fishing. It felt like a second home. The summer I'm talking about, I was 10, Tyler was 11. His dad set up the tents like always, his mom made the fire, and after dinner, Tyler and I begged to go explore the trail behind our campsite before it got too dark. His parents said fine, but be back before the sun's all the way down. We'd done it 100 times. Nothing ever happened. We walked maybe 15 minutes down the trail, kicking rocks, talking about nothing, when Tyler stopped and pointed at something off to the side. It was a shed. Small, wooden, half covered in overgrown bushes, sitting maybe 30 feet off the trail in a little clearing. We'd never noticed it before, and trust me, we'd walked that trail dozens of times over the years. It looked old, the wood gray and cracked, no windows, just a door hanging slightly open. Tyler, being Tyler, wanted to check it out. I remember feeling this weird pull in my stomach, not fear exactly, more like a warning your body gives you before your brain catches up. I told him we should head back, it was getting dark. He laughed at me, called me a baby, and walked toward it anyway. And because I was 10 and didn't want to be the kid who chickened out, I followed him. The door creaked when he pushed it open. Inside was mostly empty, just some old rusted tools, a broken shovel, a stack of rotting wood. But in the corner there was a small metal box, like a toolbox, with a padlock on it. Tyler wanted to pry it open. I told him it wasn't ours, we shouldn't mess with it. He ignored me, obviously, and started looking for something to break the lock. That's when we heard it, a vehicle, not on the trail but on some kind of dirt access road we couldn't see, somewhere close on the other side of the shed. An engine, then the crunch of tires slowing down. Tyler froze, I froze. There was no reason for a car to be back there. The campground road was in the opposite direction, and this trail wasn't for vehicles at all. We heard a door open and shut, then footsteps on gravel, unhurried, like someone who knew exactly where they were going. I want to be clear, I'm not going to sit here and tell you some stranger was hunting us through the woods, because that's not what this story is. What happened was simpler, and honestly, scarier, because of how ordinary it turned out to be, and how close we came to being caught somewhere we had no business being. Tyler grabbed my arm and pulled me down behind the stack of wood. We were both breathing so hard I thought whoever it was would hear us from outside. Through a gap in the boards, I watched a man walk up to the shed. Middle-aged, flannel shirt, work boots. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like somebody's uncle. That's what made it worse somehow. My brain couldn't process danger from someone who looked that normal. He stopped right at the doorway. I remember the smell of the wood, damp and rotting, filling my nose while I tried not to breathe too loud. He reached in, grabbed something off a shelf near the door, one of those old lanterns, and for one horrible second, he looked directly into the shed. I watched his eyes pass right over the stack of wood we were crouched behind. My heart was slamming so hard I thought it would give us away on its own. Then he turned and walked back out. We heard him messing with something outside, metal clanging, like he was loading tools into the truck bed. Tyler and I didn't move. We didn't even look at each other. We just knelt there in the dark, dust in our throats, waiting. The truck door slammed. The engine started. And then, slowly, the sound of tires pulled away down that dirt road until it faded completely into the regular night noise of the forest, crickets, wind moving through the trees. We waited another 5 minutes before either of us said a word. When we finally crawled out of that shed, the sky had gone from orange to almost black. We ran the whole way back to the trail, and by the time we reached the campsite, Tyler's parents were already outside with flashlights, panicked, calling our names. We got the lecture of a lifetime that night, grounded for the rest of the trip, but we never told them about the shed, or the man, or how close we came to being found somewhere we shouldn't have been, trespassing on private property we didn't even know existed until that exact moment. Here's the part that still gets me, even now, years later. The next morning, Tyler's dad struck up a conversation with a park ranger while we packed up the tents, just small talk, and the ranger mentioned, almost in passing, that the land behind that section of trail wasn't part of the park at all. It belonged to a private owner, someone who used it for storage, and who did not take kindly to trespassers. The ranger said there'd been complaints before, about people wandering back there, and that the owner had once fired a warning shot into the air after catching someone messing with his property. I think about that a lot. How close we came, 2 kids hiding behind a woodpile, to a man who had a reputation for handling trespassers with a gun instead of a phone call. If he'd looked half a second longer, if the light had hit the wood pile differently, if Tyler's foot had shifted on the dirt floor, that night could have ended so differently. To this day, I don't go exploring off marked trails, not even the tamest ones. Every time I see an old building tucked away from a path, half hidden in the trees, I think about that shed, that lantern, those work boots stopping right at the door. Because the scariest thing I ever lived through wasn't some monster or ghost story. It was two curious kids, an unmarked shed, and a stranger who had every reason in the world to hurt us, and just didn't look hard enough. If these stories gave you chills, hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next one. Drop a like if these stories kept you hooked, and let me know in the comments which one stayed with you the most. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next video.